Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the Sci-Fi Palestine panel. We're going to get started here shortly. I just want to make a couple of announcements first. If you're tuning in, you can go ahead and just let us know in the chat where you're coming from, so that we can know who's here, and you can also greet each other. The second thing I wanted to mention is that if you want to tweet about this event, the hashtag Palestine Writes is definitely something to use throughout the weekend, but during this panel, we would appreciate it. And then the third mention here is that you can buy any of the books that we mentioned today through the link in the bookshop that's associated with Akka Hall. So if you go inside the homepage and you click on, the Akka Hall, it'll be the showroom and different shops, and the bookshop is one of those. So you'll be able to buy any of those things, but also I'm sure see other things you didn't even know you needed. So great, thank you. I'm just seeing beautiful, beautiful. Great. Thank you. Oh, all these compliments. I didn't even know I was signing up for this. So I want to go ahead and introduce a little bit about this panel, why it was organized, and also our panelists, of course. And then we'll have a round of comments from them. And then I'll ask maybe a couple of follow-up questions. And then we'll open it up for you and leave plenty of time. So if you want to ask questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature. And the Q&A feature will allow you to, at any point in the discussion, just put your question and we'll keep a running tab and then revisit that list. Oh, wonderful. Yes, and there's a link already to bookshop.org, and that's for the bookshop. Okay. So let's see here. So let me just say a little bit. I'm Ebony Coletu, so I'm the facilitator for this discussion. I'm an assistant professor in African American Studies, African Studies, and English at Penn State University. I currently live on Lenape land in what is otherwise known as Philadelphia. And I just want to say a little bit about the theme for this panel, because there was an older description that's been circulating on social media that I think is also great. So we'll make the best of both worlds and try to say something about both. But the more immediate prompt is that there are two important publications in English that inspired our panel today. The first is Palestine Plus 100, and the second is the Book of Disappearance. So Palestine Plus 100 is a collection of science fiction stories that are guided by a prompt, a question to writers: what would your country look like in 2048, a century after the tragedies and the trauma of what has come to be called the Nakba? So Basma Ghalaini, and I don't know if she's here today, but she edited this volume and it appeared in 2019. It's a dozen stories, and they're as much about memory as future generations. They deal with violence and disappearance as much as intimacy and desire. And together, I think they really collectively push us to think about what is science fiction, what are its elements, how do we work with it and think with it. So two of our panelists have contributed to that collection, Saleem Haddad and Rawan Yaghi, who's both of them, I'll talk about their stories in a minute. Now, also published in 2019 was the Book of Disappearance, which was already published in Arabic, of course, but it was translated into English by Sinan Antoun. Ibtisam Azem is really a treasure for writing this book. I'm not sure if Sinan is also here, but I hope there can be some conversation about the translation process, as well as the book itself. We'll be talking about these two different books, but also some thematic connections between them. And that's because several years ago, when we really were in the early stages of organizing the festival, I proposed that we should have a sci-fi Palestine panel. And at that time, it seemed that there was a connection to emergent strategy practitioners here in the United States. The connection was not just to social movements or activism, but to a particular use of science fiction to think about the future in the middle of disaster, if not apocalypse. And so these groups were basically writing salons designed for activists to write in the genre of science fiction inspired by the example of Octavia Butler, and thinking together, collaborating on what a future could look like and how to deal with the residue of past harms. So in many ways, there's a deep, deep resonance and connection with our panelists here today. So even though we don't have a kind of dialogue, I do hope that we can reference and think about Adrienne Maree Brown's work on emergent strategy. She's written a book of the same name that really delves deeper into this method. And also her co-edited volume with Walida Emerisha called Octavia's Brood, which features some of these activist stories in the sci-fi genre. So that said, today our discussion is going to focus on the ways our panelists are working with science fiction as a tool to excavate loss, to bend time in many ways, to engage and also reject the very realistic lived dystopias, while at the same time trying to imagine alternative possibilities for survival, for hope even. I've asked them to each share for about 5 minutes or so some ideas about what this genre has allowed them to think through, what ideas it opens up, what problems they've encountered, how they've been able to think and collaborate with others. So we're going to use that as a prompt to kick off this discussion. So I'm going to introduce our panelists just all at once, and then I'll share with you the order of things. Okay, good. So I'm just checking the chat to make sure. You can definitely use the Q&A to ask questions. So Rawan Yaghi came to the US as a Fulbright recipient. I'm also a Fulbrighter, so high five on that, to study at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. She grew up in Gaza, where she started writing short fiction. And she contributed to the youth-led anthology Gaza Writes Back and wrote the story Commonplace for Palestine Plus 100. It's a stunning story if you have not read this collection yet. Beyond fiction, she has written for The Link, The New York Times, and Mondoweiss. So next, Saleem Haddad was born in Kuwait City to an Iraqi-German mother and a Palestinian Lebanese father. And his first novel, Guapa, I remember when this came out, published in 2016, was awarded a Stonewall Honor and won the 2017 Polari First Book Prize. He is also the author of several essays and short stories, including Song of the Birds, set in Gaza in 2048, for the Palestinian sci-fi anthology, Palestine Plus 100. Ibtisam Azem, who is gonna wrap us up today, be our third speaker, is a Palestinian short story writer, a novelist and journalist based in New York. She was born and raised in Taipei near Jaffa, and the city from which her mother and maternal grandparents were internally displaced in 1948. She is a senior correspondent for the Arabic daily Al Arabi Al Jadid. She is co-editor at Jadaliyya. She's a prolific, Jad is a prolific and essential e-zine, so just plug that. She has published 2 novels in Arabic, The Sleep Thief in 2011, and The Book of Disappearance in 2014, which was translated into English last year. Now, the Book of Disappearance, which I mentioned was translated by Sinan Antoun, was published by Syracuse University Press, and you can find all of these in the bookshop. Some of her writings have been translated and published in French, German, English, and Hebrew, and appear in several anthologies and journals. She is working on her 3rd novel, currently, and maybe she can share a little bit more about that too. Now, the panelists have chosen their order of presentation, so we'll begin with Saleem and take it from there. I'll ask a round of follow-up questions after and be checking the Q&A as we go along. So Saleem, take it away.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with all three of you today, and to be speaking also at Palestine Writes. It's such a wonderful festival, so thank you. I guess I would like to start by raising a few questions about what we decide to categorize as science fiction. So what are we talking about when we talk about science fiction? I think that genres are predominantly publishing and marketing categories. And so sometimes it becomes sexy to talk about Palestinian science fiction as a way to market certain stories. And for me as a writer, while I recognize that for marketing purposes, certain stories are sold as being from particular genres, but I don't necessarily categorize any particular story or novel of mine as being under any of these genres, and I don't really think about it while I'm writing. But when I was thinking about it for the purpose of this panel, I thought, let's take as a starting point the writer Ursula Le Guin's definition of science fiction, which she's referred to as the mythology of modern technology. I myself stumbled into this world of science fiction writing almost by accident, through the invitation to write a story for the Palestinian science fiction anthology, Palestine Plus 100. Growing up, the stories that traditionally fell under the science fiction genre didn't really appeal to me as a reader or a writer. And looking back, I suppose a big part of this is that the sort of mainstream or traditional science fiction that made its way to me in the Middle East, so much of it tended to be white Anglo-American and had such strong undercurrents of supremacy and domination. And in fact, for the longest time, what we often consider to be science fiction or what we often think of as mainstream science fiction seemed to me to be rooted in a certain kind of Western modernism that could not be detached from violent colonial ideologies. So if you take, for example, man undertakes an exploration of a strange and foreign universe, encounters an exotic other, an alien planet and its native inhabitants. Man engages in battle, conquers alien planet and its inhabitants, etc. It's not a huge leap to see the undercurrents of colonial violence and imperialism in these stories. I could not relate, nor did I desire to relate to the characters that we were supposed to consider heroes or sympathize with their imperial adventures. Even when reversed, such as an alien invasion, the colonial metaphors remained. And I couldn't help but think, I don't actually need to imagine being invaded by an alien civilization. I'm part Iraqi, Lebanese, Palestinian. I can just look out of the window. These are just my superficial impressions of the colonial underpinnings of so much of the mainstream science fiction that I grew up seeing around me. And I'm sure those who are more well-versed than me can draw many more parallels between science fiction and colonial interventions. But it does raise a question for a people fighting against settler and colonial violence. What does this traditionally imperial genre mean for us? Can we transform it to be a literature of resistance? And if so, how? How will our science fiction look differently from the science fiction produced and inspired by the colonial violence of imperial powers? Going back to Le Guin's definition, which is that science fiction is the mythology of technology. How do we as Palestinians interpret this mythology, considering the ways in which the latest technologies of surveillance and control are used to maintain the occupation and expand the Israeli settler colonial project? When it came to my own science fiction story in Palestine Plus 100, I wanted to situate my story within this context, where the technologies are utilized to control and subjugate rather than as a tool for liberation. Of course, science fiction or futurist writing is ultimately just another setting for us to explore themes and problems that affect our present time. So in writing my story, I thought about themes that impact us as Palestinians today. And one thing for me that really interested me was the idea of exploring collective memories. I've always had a very complicated relationship to nostalgia, given how obsessed our culture is with nostalgic memories, which are simultaneously a form of resistance and of power, but they can also be quite oppressive and rigid. So the idea of these collective memories being used to create a simulation that is at once a liberation and also another form of imprisonment was something I wanted to explore. And that's when I started to think of Aya, who's the protagonist in my story, this young girl who lives in this beautiful simulation of Gaza and is haunted by these visions of her dead brother and of a grotesque present that she slowly discovers. In my mind, there was no question that the story I was thinking of writing would be set in a dystopian future, but I wanted this dystopian future to be up for debate. Is it better to live in an ugly truth or a beautiful lie? Does she let go or does she continue to resist? And that's the question that Aya grapples with throughout the story. That's my 5-minute intervention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Saleem. There are plenty of conversation threads built into that 5 minutes, but let's go ahead and transition to Rawan.
Thank you, Ebony and Saleem. I think I agree with everything that Saleem said, and it really does set a really good introduction to what I'm going to say as well. I'm going to talk about how I was feeling and what I was thinking when I wrote the story, which informs a lot of the themes that go into it. So when I was in Gaza in 2018, I was going through a lot of personal difficulties. My family had been breaking apart for a decade, and I was away from my friends who were outside of Gaza, and my friends who were inside of Gaza were going through a lot of different and similar problems to me. So I worked for 12 to 15 hours a day to stop myself from thinking about anything that was going around me. So when Raw Page, the Comma Press editor and publisher, contacted me and asked me to write for Palestine Plus 100, I was scared because I had to dig inside and face everything that I was hiding from. Because for me, writing is an act of inward reflection and exploration. But my stories, the stories that I've written in the past, were realist stories. And this one was kind of an exploration of the future. And it was kind of perfect because at that time, much like all of the other young people in Gaza, I was full of anxiety and uncertainty regarding the future. And when I tried to think of it, I couldn't think of any hopeful reality. So my story is more like a realist dystopia, and it looks at the way Gaza is now and how that is just aggravated in time. So I saw like the breaking relationships around me. I saw them spreading across society. I saw a lost sense of community, trauma that is piling up to unbearable levels, leading to people using smuggled drugs, which weren't really smuggled, and just the need to be sedated and to at least exist in a different world outside of the physical one. So you you might all think that this is really extreme, but it was how I felt when I was there. You know, when you go through an experience like your family has to decide which corner of the house is the safest, the farthest from a possible target in your neighborhood, and you all like huddle in that one corner and wait for the bombs to fall. And when they start falling, you experience that kind of aggression and that kind of power. It really closes all possibilities of hope, and it makes the notion of fighting and resisting that kind of power really, I don't know, it just felt like it was pointless. So that kind of informed a lot of how I wrote this story. And another thing that I wanted to highlight is that the story is not set in Gaza. I don't say anywhere explicitly that it's set there, because Gaza is an extreme example of other things that are happening around the world. Very close to me right now here in the US, like you can see communities that are segregated invisibly, communities that are forced into poverty, drug crises that are left to eat up entire communities. So it wasn't an imagination of a reality that existed only in Gaza for me, but in so many other places. It still wasn't like a complete hopeless place for me. And this is where the relationship between my protagonist comes in. They're siblings and they are existing in this world, and they have their own world of games and their own fiction that they find solace in. And when that relationship is lost and when that relationship is broken, the protagonist is just ready to keep looking for it and to go to extremes, to go beyond the wall that keeps the city confined, in order to hold on to that relationship and hold on to that feeling that keeps him the human he is. So yeah, that's mainly what I was going through while I was writing this.
Thank you so much, because we're there with you as you're describing it. And I hope some of the people in the comments were saying, you're speaking my feelings. This is something I understand. If we can just probe more into that, what does it mean to be able to read an experience that you thought you would never see written down, or that's held, and not shared? Because I see that as a theme in all of your work, that there always some character who feels it cannot be expressed what's happened. So I just want to acknowledge that, and then we can transition to Ibtisam.
Thank you, Ebony, and I'm it's very touching, Rawan, what you shared, and I'm very honored to be with you and with Saleem and with you, Ebony, and thanks for Palestine Writes for having me. I will start about traditional definition of science fiction. And if we look at it, it says that it is based on imagined future scientific or technological advances and major social or environmental changes. The central event in my novel, in my second novel, is a supernatural event with major social and political effects, and that is the disappearance of all Palestinians in historic Palestine. that supernatural event does not get explained. It is interesting that the reviews and readings in the Arab world did not consider the Book of Disappearance a work of science fiction, neither did I. It is only after the English translation appeared that several reviewers and readers describe it as such or partly such. The question of how translated literature from the global south is received and categorized is an important and worth thinking about, but that's probably for a different discussion. That's not to say that those who described, that's not to say that those who described it as such did not have a point when talking about it as speculative fiction because of its futuristic or supernatural event. So why did I write the novel the way I did? The premise of the novel, as I said, is one day Israelis woke up to discover that all Palestinians have disappeared from historic Palestine. But I had a challenge. Do I want a novel that is only occupied with the colonizers, the Israelis, and what will happen within their society or how they react to the disappearance of Palestinians? The answer was no, and or at least not only. I wanted to write about that too, but I wanted to write about the silence regarding the continuous Nakba and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 48 until today. Also the ongoing occupation, killing, land confiscation, not only in occupied West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, but also in historic Palestine. The silence is in a way a continuation of the violence, the violent act. Silence is also covering or denying or ignoring. The novel holds mirrors and of sorts of the perpetrators, their silent accomplices and the silent bystanders. But the novel is more than that. It's also about loneliness that survivors and their children and grandchildren feel in their colonized homeland. I wanted to bring Palestinian voices back to the narrative. So I brought them back, not only through the magical realism and unexplained sudden disappearance, in other words, not only through their present absent, but through bringing Palestinian voices back to the story and giving them a prominent place. One way to do that through the diary of Ala, the Palestinian character that is found by his Israeli neighbor after the disappearance. In his diary, Ala writes to his deceased grandmother. In these chapters of the novel that are taken from the memoirs that were found, the Palestinian speaks for the first time without waiting for anyone to listen or comment. Also, the genre of the memoirs is important because the character is preconditioned to delving deep into himself and contemplating their subjectivity and hopefully attaining a more expansive perspective. Through the perspective of writing, the Palestinian takes charge of his own narrative. He tells his own story, and theoretically no one can silence him, her, or stop them. This way, Ala chapters are his alone and are separate from other parts of the novel, and no one can commenting on them. Through the memories, I also tried to bring the issue of indigenous memory. It is the memory of the native that is trying to face the colonizers' constant action of trying to change the impose their own vision of a place and story, to replace the memoirs of the memories of the colonized after they took their land. There's another aspect regarding the native memory, and that is the issue of collective memory and individual memory. But more importantly for my novel, The Book of Disappearance, was the intergenerational memory and the memory of the colonized place as lived and experienced differently by different generations of Palestinians. And what does that mean for their being in the present, but for their history and future? The question is how to bring this into play without dismissing the different experiences that generations of Palestinians went through, where to find the balance between the individual and the collective and the memory of the place. One of the ways I dealt with it is through also through the story of the city of Jaffa. And Jaffa was the most important city in Palestine before the Nakba, before 48, culturally, economically. The majority of its people were Palestinians, they were displaced and became refugees until today. So I will stop here, and where today you see Jaffa is more of a ghetto, but I will stop here and then we will take it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can already see that the questions are starting to pile up. So as panelists, definitely take a look at that. There is an opportunity here to just ask a couple of follow-up questions based on the remarks you've already shared. So I do want to revisit that. You know, Saleem, your comments were so, I think, excellent at framing some of the full range of issues involved, not only in classification, but also the work you're trying to do in a kind of anti-colonial sense and a decolonial sense within a genre. And so I did have a question for you about the way that technology works with this idea of the digital return being, on the one hand, something that's maybe we're participating in a little bit too, you know, with this Palestine Writes and the pandemic and trying to really adapt ourselves to the circumstances that we're working in. So there's something appealing about that. But at the same time, you have a very strong character, Ziad, who is really persuasive in saying, get out of the matrix, don't buy it, you know, and yet that character is himself, you know, deteriorating. So you're holding some complexity for us about this, you know, desire for something, you know, to be together in some kind of way. And at the same time, a warning comes with that too. Can you say more about what you were trying to balance there and what conversation you think that opens up?
Well, I think I can talk about it from my perspective as being a Palestinian from the diaspora and one that has only been to Palestine once, and that was a long time ago, nearly 30 years ago now. I guess for me the question was, and this very much speaks to also when my experience reading Ibtisam's novel. It was the same thing, this idea around collective memory and the sense of loneliness, because I'm aware that my connection to Palestine is very tenuous and always up for question. My link is very much through my grandmother and her memories of the Nakba. And my grandmother and I have a very close relationship, but she's also very much at the end of her life. And so it has really raised a lot of questions for me. After she dies, what is my relationship with Palestine then? Does that exist in a very tangible way? And what does letting go of that mean? What are the benefits of letting go of that, of just disappearing into other identities, just saying, well, I've accepted this loss and now I need to move on and live my life wherever I am. And so I think I was exploring these questions in the context of these two characters. Ziad, who's someone who's very much not wanting to let go and resisting, and encouraging Aya, who's somewhat ambivalent about it or hasn't made up her mind yet about the benefits of holding on to I guess the real Palestine outside of the simulation. So these were the questions that I was thinking about in the context of myself as I was writing. And I guess if others read it, then, you know, people approach the text from different perspectives, and so they might get different things out of the text than that. But that was sort of where I was coming from.
Excellent, excellent. You know, I'm also going to be mindful of time. I have questions for each of you, so I'm going to do a little bit of consolidation and to allow us to shift into the Q&A from the audience. I do see a question, you know, for Rawan, and this is from Dalal Hamoudeh. How are you able to coalesce such trauma into vivid yet controlled writing? And I want to add on to that and ask, you know, what is the process of writing? Is it a process of control, or is it a process of letting go, or is it a process of emotional kind of unburdening? You described it in several different ways as a kind of confrontation with something that is normally controlled in your everyday life. So I would love for you to maybe address this question here, but also think about what is writing? Is it control, or is it something else?
Definitely. I think it's a little bit of both. I think that my initial, the first draft at least is a total loss of control. And it's kind of going into so many worlds and so many ideas. And I have to leave it for quite a while before I can go back and make it more controlled. The language in the first draft is really awful, like very unpublishable. So I think it's very chaotic and chaotic, but in a nice way. It's kind of like, and this is only how I write. It's really, I don't advise anyone to write the way I do, but it's not very structured for me, especially my characters. I don't start building characters before I write the story, so they develop with the story, and that can be a little messy and uncontrolled. But I think the process of writing, especially in the publishing world, is just many times of going over what you've written and trying to make it look more controlled and look more presentable. But I think the purpose of it is to be completely lost in it and to be reflective on so many emotions that are not as controlled as your writing, emotions that you avoid for a reason. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to do another consolidation, if that's okay. And this one comes, I think this is Sadia Agsus, and this is in maybe an indirect way addressed to Ibtisam because of the way that you talked about the problematics of science fiction and maybe other writing traditions that inform your approach to storytelling. And Sadia says, can't we talk about definitions, plural, that Arabic literature and the Palestinian one has its own definitions that are far from the classical Western one? So is there a tradition in itself that is Palestinian that you would consider? And then I'm going to add on to that in the spirit of consolidation, which is to say, is there some merit, and maybe this invites Saleem as well, is there some merit in reimagining the work of these hypothetical premises, right? The idea of a day of Palestinians disappearing, right? The idea of the genre really getting you into a realistic posture with that. So, you know, you have to accept that this is the nature of the premise, that this is, the disappearance is real, even as the characters debate, is it a strike? Is it, you know, an organized, you know, mass murder? What is it? But something in this genre says you have to entertain it. What does that do? Is that part of a different tradition? And is it worthwhile to think of a science fiction tradition within Palestinian literature?
That's an interesting question in a way. I mean, I agree also with Saleem. I have a similar approach to the issue of genres and definitions. Although I studied also literature, and but when writing is always, it's a different approach than reading, maybe in a way. But you can think about people in Palestinian tradition like Emil Habibi and his novel Al-Mutasha'il and other writing. But for me, the issue of disappearance, and sometimes what people get wrong about this novel, is this novel is actually more about Palestinians, and the disappearance is also another character of the novel, in the sense of it's not only something in the future, but it's also something that did happen. And this is what the novel is trying to talk about. The fact that you have 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 who were displaced, the majority of whom became refugees, the majority of whom until today can't return, etc. This is things that the world doesn't want to talk about. In the best case scenario, they talk about the occupation of Palestine in 1967. But often they don't want to talk about the first occupation, the colonialization of Palestine. And for me, that was a very important thing to talk about and to put it out there and to say that this is something that is still going in a different way. And Saleem and Rawan were talking about different experience of Palestine because of also, not only in Saleem's case growing up in the diaspora, but also in Rawan's case where you can't leave the prison called Gaza, and all these different or hard to leave. And so it's different Palestinian realities, but they are all part of the one Palestine issue. And it's for me important to make this connection, not to look at what's happening with Palestinians in 48 or as different or something separate or than what's happening with other Palestinians in other places. It's all connected.
Beautiful. And I'm so glad you raised that question too, about how to think of this mode of writing as sort of never losing sight of the connections, of figuring out a narrative that could hold it. So I really appreciate that. Let's actually shift, and if you all want to also take a look at the Q&A list, let's start from maybe the first question. Ahmed El Yaqub, with sci-fi, how do you avoid turning the story into a wish list of what we want the future to be? I think these panelists don't necessarily sign up for that. The dystopian realism, right, is not necessarily a wish list of how you want the future to be. But I will maybe flip it and say, have you ever been tempted to write a very different kind of visionary or speculative fiction that's far more optimistic? And I see you laughing, like cackling. You've never been tempted.
I think for me, it's more, I mean, I would love to actually be, I don't know, I say that, I would love, I mean, it would be quite empowering, I think, to think of futurist writing as something that we can strive for and strive towards. And I would love to write in this sort of, utopian future. I guess I would just question whether there is such a thing as a utopian future, because I'm so critical that I would just imagine future dysfunctions within whatever utopic setting we might create for ourselves. But maybe that's just me as a cynic. I don't know.
Yeah, and maybe there are hybrids that are possible and have to be explored. I do think that was one of the features that I noticed with Emergent Strategy kind of writings, is that they were this hybrid of dystopia with these little kind of glimmers of things that worked and things that seemed to give a hint of a society you wanted to be in. So maybe there are different ways of doing it. And then maybe can I follow up, since you're already talking, let's see. Dalal says, for Saleem, what are the writers that have inspired you? Some of what you said reminded me of Huxley. And then if in any way you can, Brent Horwath has also written a comment, if in any way you can blend those two together, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So Dalal, I guess you're talking specifically about the Palestine Plus 100 short story. What's funny is, no, I wasn't, I mean, I'd read Huxley a long time ago, so maybe there were elements that sort of dripped in. But I was, at the time of writing, I was in a very melancholic state, to put it mildly. And I was reading a lot of the poet Fernando Pessoa's writing, and he talks a lot about dreams. And so I was very much looking at dreams as an escape. So that was sort of one of the underpinnings of the story. And that's why dreams were the portal for Aya to communicate with her brother. So I think Pessoa was a big inspiration. And I think it was a Maya Angelou quote where she talked about freedom feeling like an itchiness under the skin. I can't remember the exact quote, but that's how I remember it. And that stayed with me. And I think I just used that energy to write the Aya character and her desire for escape. But it's funny because I hadn't realized the parallels with the Matrix when I was creating my story at all, because I hadn't seen the Matrix in such a long time until I gave the story to my partner and he said, "This is the Matrix. You realize that?" And I thought, "Oh shit, is it?" And so we rewatched the Matrix, and I was thinking, wow, this is so much like the Matrix. And I thought that was an interesting sort of subversion of that concept, but it wasn't intentional at all. On the second question around environmental degradation, yes, it was intentional. But I don't think it's a dystopia. I think we're living in it. I mean, I think you just need to go to the shores of Beirut or even Gaza to see what's happening to the sea over there. So my intention wasn't really to imagine anything, but to present the reality as it is at the moment.
I'm going to ask, maybe this is a question for everyone, from Kate Wilson, which is why each writer created a protagonist of another gender. And I think it's, of course, everyone's prerogative to create a character of any gender or a hybrid of genders that you prefer. But I suppose the question is about cultivating sort of perspective through specific genders and how you choose to frame the story. So maybe if you have any thoughts about the selection of the characters, I'm thinking also Ibtisam, your Ala, has a very moving way of being himself, but also channeling his grandmother's wisdom in such a I don't know, very palpable way. You feel her talking. So maybe it's there are many ways to answer that question, that are not so singular. But if any of you want to choose to reflect on gender and character development.
I mean, absolutely. It's not that I don't think about the gender issue when I write. Of course, I think about it. It's just that for me in this novel, and also even in the first novel, The Sleep Thief, it felt naturally and that this character will be a male character. But as you said in Ala's, in the second one, it's also, we hear his grandmother voice, the way he perceived it. So she is also one of the main characters. But whether you choose whatever gender you choose, or even a socioeconomic class background, etc., the most important thing for me is that I don't impose as a writer my own ideas and thoughts on this character, but let it be itself, and in a way that it's also I don't like the word authentic, but somehow in a way that the characters are going to, this is the way they're going to talk and think, and not my ideas and my my own thoughts impose them on them. And in a strange way, even the characters in the novel that I don't agree with or I don't like, even I have to like them when I write, because I have to flow with them. I have to go with with them in order to be able to make them close to the reader and to be convinced by them as a writer. Because when I go back and I also don't write. I do a lot of sketches and I go back and forth a lot. And when I look at their last drafts, I need to be convinced that it's working, that the music, the dramaturgy of the work is working. And that's important. So then, yeah.
Rawan, I wonder if you also had some thoughts, because you mentioned something about the characters sort of having their own worlds, their own lives, and maybe even that they choose their own identities. It sounds like. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think I didn't have gender as a theme in my story. The reason I chose, I mean, the male protagonist is not the only protagonist in my story. He and his sister are two protagonists. And I think to me, the male character was a little bit of an anti-hero and kind of like just a person who's just going with the flow. And, you know, until a certain point where he decides to break out. I mean, in my previous stories, the characters were mostly children, because that's a group that I wanted to focus on. And when I started writing, I was myself a teenager. So I think gender to me, it's important when I think of all of the social issues that I think of when I write and when I exist. My existence as a woman in Gaza is very different from any man's there. But it's also an identity that is in that interacts with other aspects of your identity, you know, being a Palestinian and a woman, being from a certain class, the way you dress and the way you present yourself, and all of these issues. And I think looking at the future, if I was looking at it through my eyes as a woman, I would have seen it even darker, and the story would have probably been intolerable to people. So yeah, I think I might have wanted to tone it down a little. And also this is the first time I've written from the point of view of a man. And I wanted to explore that, basically, because men in Gaza do have more physical freedom inside Gaza. They can go out at night. They can go to cafes. They can go to certain places alone without people, you know, feeling like, you know, giving them stares and stuff like that. So yeah, I wanted to explore that kind of aspect of being a Palestinian in Gaza, because while I was living there, I couldn't live that.
Thank you for that. You know, as you were saying that, it made me think a lot about your other comment about the themes of the story, about sedation, about dissociating from physical reality, and that maybe, you know, this character choice is also a way to emphasize kind of jumping into different physical experiences that are not your own, you know. Let's also kind of pivot a little bit back. I've been trying to click on some of these answers, though, but we still have many more. And so I want to ask, okay, so Saleem, we have two grandmother questions. And so I'm going to combine them. And then the first one says, oh, and this is Ibtisam, this is also a crossover with you, right? How does intergenerational memory and futurism work for you? And by work, I'm going to combine it with this other question from Zainab about this relaying of familial narratives called post-memory. How do you narrate these stories of the Nakba? What would you add? How have you felt that you are recreating home and return in doing so? So maybe this sounds like, what is the work of writing the grandmother's stories or memories or dialogue or wisdom? And then what is this kind of, maybe gesture toward self-critique, because I hear Ibtisam saying, oh, I don't like authenticity. I hear Saleem saying, you know what, don't fall into the matrix of nostalgia. So, if we can kind of say, what's the function of these grandmother voices? And at the same time, where does your kind of critique or skepticism kick in, even in your own writing? Did I put you on the spot, Saleem? That was big eyebrow.
I was hoping Ibtisam would go first. The grandmother character in Guapa was inspired by my Palestinian grandmother. But I mean, as I've said, she's a very important presence in my life, and she has been. And as a result, Palestine has also been a very important presence in my life growing up, and it's how I've identified for the most part. And I don't know if I have an easy answer in terms of how you narrativize these stories and keep these memories alive. And it's something that I've been grappling with a lot as the years go on. And it's something that I have thought a lot about as well when I was reading Ibtisam's novel. Because I think reading the novel filled me or put me in a very anxious state. And I don't know if that was your intention, Ibtisam, but that's how I felt it myself. This sense of a haunting and this sense that time was moving on and these memories were going to be lost and there was nothing that can be done to hold on to these memories. And the only thing that we can hope for is that when all is said and done, we remain as a haunting, and that will be our memory. And maybe that's a very sort of dark picture, but that's sort of where I've been heading. And at least the experience of reading Ibtisam's novel and also reading beside it Adania Shibli's novel, I think they both spoke about these very similar themes. And they're very complicated themes, and perhaps I've simplified it by painting a dark picture. But that's sort of what I've been left with. Yeah.
Ibtisam, do you want to jump in?
No, absolutely. No, I think you did it actually describe it very beautifully. Yeah, there is the aspect of the hunting, and there is the question, and we have this question also in all other countries that live under settler colonialist systems, whether in the US or in other South Africa. And how do you look and relate to your own colonized place and public space and your land? And the grandmother issue, and I want to take something that Saleem was talking about, the issue of memories and the issue of when I grew up, because we in our school system as Palestinians, citizens of Israel back then, and I think still until today, although it's Arabic schools, but the education system, Israeli education system, and we did not learn Palestinian literature. We learned Arabic literature, but not Palestinian. Instead, we learned also in the Hebrew lessons, extremely very Zionist, a lot of Zionist literature that talking about our own homeland as an empty, as a land without people, etc. So you grew up as a child and you see, and of course, the history lessons, and you have to ask yourself, where is my Palestine in Palestine? And it takes a lot of time to also to live with the fact that you're, I don't know how to put it mildly, but to re-love or fall in love in your own place without forgetting that is on the colonialization and the pain that's still going, because it's not over. It's not, we are not in post-colonial world. We are still living and going through this world. And grandmothers, I think, and sometimes also grandfathers, but in my personal case, it was my grandmother who will tell all these stories. It was because of her, and my mother was more of the silence person, and my grandfather, her husband, like from my mother's side. So the connection with her is very important. And I think for a lot of Palestinians, especially for Palestinians who live in the diaspora, this is a very, or in exile, this is a very important connection. And but even for Palestinians who grew up in Palestine, there is so many geographies and levels of the past memory, the now, and the imagined. Which kind of Palestine do you want to have also? And that's something that's, that I'm also, I think a lot about. But I didn't get to the point to write a story that's optimistic, or not yet. Let's see.
I feel like this has become a kind of little kernel of possibility in this panel. Like in a couple of years, we'll look back on it and say, wait a minute, this was the origin. Now, I want to ask a more general question to everyone. I'm going to ask Rawan to kick us off. And this is from Karim Estefan. As more speculative writers, how do you relate to a Palestinian tradition of resistance literature? I'm thinking about classic stories like Khan Afani's Return to Haifa, which closes with a clear commitment to armed struggle. Of course, this was in the context of his involvement with the PFLP and the militancy of the Palestinian Revolution. And today there's instead a corrupt neoliberal Palestinian Authority. Is there more speculative writing in Palestine today because of an ambiguity or a sense of limbo in the present? And the reason why I'm asking Rawan this is because, if anything, I get a strong sense of this relationship between siblings that is defined by a limbo existence, right? This not quite dead, not quite alive. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about resistance literature, or if any of this has been part of your thinking as you write.
That's a very good question. And I'll start by saying that literature is the literature that I grew up with, and the literature that inspired me to write as well, because it made me feel, and it made me think about the struggles and the stories of the characters that Aslan Kanafani wrote about. And it made me imagine histories that, unlike Saleem and Ibtisam, my grandmother hasn't told me about. But when I'm writing, I think about how I'm feeling, that's one thing, and how people like me or people who are in my generation feel. And of course, they're not a monolithic, we don't all feel the same way. And there are a lot of young people who believe in resistance, and resistance in all of its forms. But I think the sense that I had while writing this story is that there's a huge feeling of skepticism, distrust in leadership, and the feeling of betrayal from young people. they feel like they're constantly being exploited for various narratives like whether it's aid or resistance or anything else. And that is a point of view that nobody has explored in literature, and people are scared of exploring because it goes against the image of the Palestinian, the image of Samud, and the fact that we continue to struggle, we continue to fight. But that's not the case, especially in a place in Gaza. There are a lot of young people who are tired, simply tired. And who know that their futures are on pause, basically, because of Israel and because of selfish people who are exploiting them. So I think, even though I do believe that, we have the right to resist, and I wish we had better tools to resist. My generation and a lot of people in my generation have that sense of, betrayal and feeling like we need to look inside first, amongst ourselves before we fight as one people. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Believe it or not, we have less than 10 minutes left. And so what I'm going to do is do another little fusion question and then invite each of you to share any final thoughts. And I'm going to ask not just a generic final thought, but rather if there are any thoughts you have about each other's work or any connections you're feeling now that are maybe important to articulate, because you're not just writers, you're also readers of each other. So I think I'm going to combine these, one from an anonymous attendee and then one from Mustafa Amiani. And this question is about maybe our kind of latent theme, which is, and Sarwa just said this as well about, the way trauma comes up in a lot of this work in science fiction. But on the other end, Mustafa has pointed out that there's a lot of potential also in the genre for queer or other marginalized identities. So how to think about what Mustafa calls the unfaithful children of the colonial project, or to think about technology and queer marginalization / empowerment, is such a polarized political landscape where belonging for queer identities is impossible. Is there a place for a sci-fi alternative? So this is also what the anonymous attendee says. Having written speculative fiction, do you have thoughts on why this idea of emergence, as we see in Emergent Strategy, this imagining of other worlds, other ways of relating to each other, other ways of building or sustaining relationships, why it appears in science fiction. So I'm going to tweak it and say that this is a speculative question because your own writing probably is much more interested in the trauma side of this dystopian realism. But is there anything in this speculative fiction that invites you to think of different ways of relating to each other, even ways that don't feel realized today? Is there anything interesting in that for you?
You can start.
Oh
no,
go for it. I wanted to touch on Mustafa's question. I think it's funny because for the last several months I've had on my to-do list to explore queer futurist writing, and it keeps getting pushed back. But I do think that there's a lot of potential. I mean, I think when you think of queerness, it's not really, I think of queerness as a direction of travel, as something on the horizon that we are always reaching towards, but we never actually reach to, because it's, you know, queerness is constantly evolving. And so I think there's a lot there in terms of exploring queer and marginalized identities and speculative or futurist writing. It's not one that I've explored yet, and I think the answer probably lies in your second question, which I can't see now, but I think it was something about, or is it, in such a polarized political landscape where belonging for queer identities is impossible, is there a place for a sci-fi alternative? And at least for me, when I'm exploring queer subjects in my writing, so much of it is a political choice to make it as real, as to situate these queer subjects and queer characters in real life situations, because we're here and we live in this environment and we experience this environment and we have our struggles and our challenges and our joys in this environment. And yet we are not really seen as much. And so I think situating queer characters and queer writing in the now, in the real, is an important political act in itself, I think, beyond queer futurist writing.
And that was just a perfect opportunity to say you can check out Guapa in the bookshop, because I think that sort of very present tense, very granular everydayness, right, of queer reality is very much a part of your work and kind of the legacy you're forming. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. I also want to invite, you know, any other, again, final comments, either in response to the question or just thoughts that are crystallizing through the course of this particular panel that we've had together. And again, really appreciate that you all are here and that we've had at our maybe high point about 200 people join us. Any final thoughts?
I will jump in very quickly. I think there is several things that Rawan and Saleem were talking about. And I think you can find it in a lot of times in the Palestinian literature, even early on. And that's, I think Rawan mentioned the issue of anti-hero, the issue of betrayal. And in Saleem's writing too, I mean, when you look into characters who are going into their inner world and trying to maybe disillusion themselves from what the world outside is telling them, how they should be or what they are, or how they should feel about themselves. And I think these are very, not only common things, but things that also I like to read, because I feel like they challenge me, but also they give me, as on the other hand, as a writer, a way to look at what I write from another or additional perspective. Yeah, and I will leave it there.
We have 3 minutes left. Who would like to take the last word? I saw that facial expression. Rawan, any final thoughts?
Just that this discussion has been really amazing. It's made me think about a lot of aspects of writing, and writing speculative and dystopian fiction as well. And I just wanted to say that I do want to write fiction that is less about reality, because I don't know, maybe I talk about writing as a way to explore my feelings, but I think that you can also give yourself a break and give yourself a chance to imagine something that would make you feel differently. I want to see Palestinian superheroes, for example, or superheroes that I, as a Palestinian, or a little kid, as a little Palestinian kid or Arab kid, can aspire to to be like, or can love. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of power in writing realist dystopias, but I do want to explore different things as well.
Beautiful. I think this is also a great way to end and connect it back to maybe the original idea for this panel, which was to think about this practice that developed with Emergent Strategy of trying to figure out how do you get through what feels like the worst of it and still have an imagination about possibility. And I deeply appreciate all of you for sharing today, but also the questions that were asked, the deep engagement in the chat, and for making this really a satisfying panel for everyone. So I appreciate it. We are ending on time because I have to teach a class. So otherwise I might have dragged this on for another 15 minutes. So thank you all.
Thank you.